Let's pause and take stock before we plunge into the 20th century on totalitarians of Western philosophy. Uh, I taught political philosophy over and over again for many years, and I took somewhat different approaches at different times. But basically, until the last few years, maybe, I taught it as a series of classic texts. I mean, I think this is a defensible approach. It also ends up being all male and stuff like this. I guess I got some early feminists in later on in my teaching career. But so, big chunks of classic texts. We've done 5 of the texts that I often taught or standardly taught as classics in Western political philosophy. So we've done Plato's Republic. We've done Hobbes' Leviathan. We've done Social Contract of Rousseau, Philosophy of Right of Hegel, and the Communist Manifesto of Marx. Right. So, I regard those as totalitarian texts for all the reasons I've been giving. Again, I guess I don't want to be held to some extremely specific definition of totalitarianism. All those texts are enthusiastic about power hierarchy and state oppression. Sorry. Now, that's not everything I taught in that sequence. And it's worth mentioning that there are non-totalitarian, at least for my money, strands of Western philosophy. Some of them are extremely problematic, some not so much, I guess. But for example, I taught Aristotle's Politics every time I taught that course. And I'm not listing Aristotle as a totalitarian. Now, does he experiment with the idea that some people are naturally slaves and some are naturally free or naturally masters? Well, yes, he does. And there's all kinds of problems in Aristotle. But he also sort of ends up recommending a mixed form of government with, somewhat balanced powers, limited government functions to some extent, all this kind of stuff. All right. So, it's just not straightforward, singular lion experts like Plato. And actually, Aristotle's Politics starts from, and I guess in my head, like a qualification and a rejection of Plato's Republic. Aristotle's very explicit about that. He says that Plato's Republic is too unitary. And the totalitarianism is one aspect of that. Plato fantasizes a single being as a republic, or fancies a republic that's the same as, structurally analogous to, and in so many ways the same as, a human individual. And that's really an important moment in this whole development of Western totalitarianism. That's connected to the Hobbes Leviathan. That's connected to the general will, the state of Hegel, etc. The individual, the analogy of the individual to the polis. All right. So anyway, Aristotle, I'm not listing as a totalitarian. Of course, I taught Locke's Second Treatise of Government every time I taught Hobbes, and again, I think social contract theory does not work out at all. And any way you cut it. And also, I think the state that Locke constitutes is far too powerful for my money or whatever. But I'm not, by the same token, I'm not accusing Locke or classical liberals, especially in the Lockean vein, of totalitarianism. Okay, so I mean, there's as much. I mean, okay, so or then I would by the time I get through some Rousseau, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Like I say, I don't really think Rousseau's a very great philosopher, even though he's absolutely pivotal in the intellectual and political history of Europe. Uh, but I think he's not as good a philosopher as Hobbes and Locke, that's for sure. And in somewhat the same vein. So that was always one that I taught it sometimes, and I jettisoned it, or sometimes it's on the syllabus, and we're 2 weeks behind by the time we get there, and so let's skip Rousseau. All right. But okay, so or I guess another text I should before I said Locke, I should have said Machiavelli. All right. Now, Machiavelli gives you all kinds of advice for maintaining your hyper oppressive rule, Cesare Borgia. Yeah. I mean, the prince is in favor of absolute rule in lots of ways, and it's all about strategically assassinating your opponents and shit like this, or how to conquer Italy. But on the other hand, he just doesn't straightforwardly recommend what we would think of as totalitarian government, and you have to take seriously the discourses on Titus Livy, and his actual probably commitment to some form of republicanism. Okay, uh, ancient style republicanism, ultimately. Meanwhile, he wants Italy reunited with a crushing fist of doom, baby. Right? By a man with no scruples. So we could have done some Machiavelli, but I'm not counting Machiavelli as I'm not exactly counting as a political philosopher exactly either, but I always did teach the Prince. All right. Or, okay, so, and then, after Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, I would teach Thoreau's civil disobedience, insist on it, okay? Uh, I describe it as the only actual egalitarian moment, including Marx. For real. All right. And also, it's the only expression of anarchism that I would insert in the classical uh, sequence. But this is a rather devastating fact about what we standardly think of as the high peaks of Western political philosophy. The standard sequence features. I mean, and we should talk about the medieval stuff too, because we just omitted 2,000 years or something, right? Like, okay, that's a lot. I don't know, Hellenistic. What's up with Hellenistic political philosophy? I don't know. All right. It's not all totalitarian, and it's a complex terrain, Western political philosophy, but so much of it is so raucously in your face totalitarian. Right? And so many people are so enthusiastic about these figures and find them so inspiring. So I just want to say that infesting the Western tradition fundamentally is the yearning for totalitarianism. You can feel that undertone, man, as soon as the enthusiasts for Plato start talking. I mean, I think Plato's totalitarianism is a totalitarianism of experts. Right? You can sort of see the worst sort of elitism of the left in the last 10, 20 years, where the cult of science and like you should do whatever the Harvard faculty tells you to do all day, every day. Like, that's pretty Platonic republic. But so to try to organize these thoughts a little bit, or just to look at this as kind of an integral development in certain ways, we could look at some of the themes. Like I say, the idea of um, the polis, the state, the culture, the nation as an individual. It's just an analogy. and it's one that strikes you immediately. Or it's easy to suggest such a thing, but it's incredibly problematic. Okay, just like, and Aristotle actually understood this. Like, this is what's one thing that's gone wrong with Plato. Like, he thinks that a polis is like an individual, and it has three parts, and one of them should be running the other two. Okay. Aristotle's like, no, no, no. A polis is a very diverse set of people, and who are coming together to try to have a communal life or whatever. Like, that's not the same as an individual personality. But the Hobbes Leviathan is an individual. It's like an attempt to make all of us together a single individual. The Rousseau general will. The Hegel state. And I just want to mark off that's problematic, that's optional, that analogy, and that it evidently has totalitarian implications, because Hobbes likes it, and Plato likes it, and Rousseau likes it, and Hegel likes it, and those are all screeching totalitarians, and I have shown this. All right, maybe Rousseau is, you could quibble with my reading of Rousseau, like, as a totalitarian. It's more complex, but I think it could not be clearer with Hegel or Plato. For instance, could not be clearer with Marx. Now, so I would say, like, there is an enduring yearning to be subdued, or to subdue the folks you think should be subdued. So like and so I tend to read this, partly this is because of what happens to an anarchist, where people diagnose rather than argue against your politics. I read this in a recent review in the Times Literary Supplement by David Graeber. The guy, this Susskind, an economist, sort of described Graeber's anarchism as a kind of adolescent anti-daddy rebellion or something like that. That's the kind of thing you get a lot if you're an anarchist. All right, so I just want to say that, the ground of totalitarianism is either sexual masochism, like I want to be subdued, or sexual sadism. I want to subdue y'all. Okay? There's a lot more masochists than sadists out here. And this has a masochist quality, because these people are not exactly running the government, right? They're more like begging to be disempowered, including to have their own philosophies repressed, actually. It's amazing. All right. Now, but things change, right? Like, okay, so Plato's Republic is just fantastical. It's just a pure fictional invention. There really is not the equipment to make something like that happen, even though he's projecting it, he's fantasizing it. Like, if you're in Greece in 400 BC, and you're saying there should be a public education system that educates all children from birth, removes them from the care of their parents, and remakes their brains from birth, that's everyone, all citizens. Like, we are very far from being able to do that in Thebes, right? Like, I guess Sparta maybe came close in some ways, right? It's not that realistic, and that's okay too. Like, in a way, like, you think inventing utopias, it could be obviously a useful exercise. Like, where do we want to go? Where would we want to go if we could do anything? That's useful to ask. Right? And the sheer utopian of it doesn't necessarily make it totalitarian, although as soon as people in the West start making utopias, they start making totalitarian utopias, or nightmares, actually. dystopias. They start making dystopias because they love power, love political power. All right. So anyway, but you could have a free utopia. You could fantasize an anarchist utopia. Occasionally I do. I try to resist that impulse in myself, but as long as you're not saying like, and we can make this happen with bayonets, a la Engels or whatever, then maybe you're just having a project for let's go in this direction. Now, the idea of all of us together in the polis, forming a single body and being analogous to a single individual personality and being a person, and like in the status period, like actually being a person, that's what Hobbes says, like personating the population, representing the whole population as a person, right? Like, so the state does this and that. The state negotiates with the other state, like as if it were a person or a personality or a mind, a la Hegel. Right. Well, that's a fantasy of belonging, I would say. Like that's an expression of the fact that our individuality, our separation from one another is experienced as intolerable. And we're lonely. And we would like, because we're Western philosophers, we would like to be food processed into a kind of human borscht. All together, one thing. Now, this has amazing permutations as stuff goes on. And I think it changes. Like, even through Hegel, you sort of get this idea that, not really. Okay, so, up through Rousseau, you get this idea like we can all be a single collective body if we just get rid of all our rights or whatever, just agree to it. Right? We can all merge into one mind, right? But by the time you get to Hegel, 50 years after Rousseau, or not even really, like pretty quick, and Fichte too, and other idealists and stuff, and Herder, like, okay, now, the question becomes real quick, who's in and who's out? The whole as the general will is one thing, but the nation and the nation state and Hegel, Herder, Fichte, etc., is something else. It doesn't include everybody, man. We have to decide who counts as a true German. Everyone's worried about that for 100 years or more, 150 years, until they get to the camps to help figure out who's a true German. All right. So, so nations, those are mini general wills. They're not everybody. Okay, now we start having collective identities, and that's what's I've been saying is so characteristic of the political philosophy of the 19th century. Generating collective identities and explaining all of history with regard to collective identities. And again, one of the humorous features of this is they give you options, man. Are the fundamental collective identities nations? By the end of the century, it's races, and W.B. Du Bois or Gobineau, they're both saying things like, he who neglects the race question neglects the fundamental question of all history. The basic actors of history are the races, says Du Bois in The Conservation of the Races in 1890s. The basic actors are races. Well, races and nations are they different? Are they the same? No, they're different. No, they're the same. How many races are there? How many nations are there? Well, there might be 17 races, or there might be only 3 or 5, or, but those are the fundamental agents of history. And maybe embodied in particular individuals and stuff like this. Okay. And then could be racial nationalism that combines these two things. Maybe we're getting a resurgence now because we haven't really gotten that far beyond the 19th century politically. Really, we have not. Okay, we're still wrestling with all this shit, all the concepts, socialism, capitalism. I don't think actually these things have any purchase in the world. but they're 19th century political and economic categories that are still seem inevitable. Okay, so races, nations, also genders, and then Marx with classes. And then the whole social movements focused on class for, again, 150 years or more, getting toward 200. And, okay, and then, we really need, and we got this way too late, intersectionality. What happens when races and classes and nations all intersect in one body? Genders. People start individuating again, I guess. I don't know. Now, one thing about those collective identities, they purport to be discovered, right? Like thinkers purport to discover these identities. Now we see race, the 5 races. That's the basic explanatory feature of history. And this is just a biological fact that we found out about the world by measuring craniums and assessing skin colors and so on. Okay, it's an antecedent fact that we've discovered. Now, races are manufactured, dude. And that's true of all these collective identities. Manufactured by oppression. Right? Race is a bunch of biological bullshit, man. You know this is true. The child of a black person and a white person in America still is a black person. No, that's just a social convention. It has nothing to do with nothing. Okay, and skin tone, I don't know, man. Whatever. That is not a fundamental difference between persons, and it's a spectrum, not 5 pigeonholes, right? All the way, through the color wheel, basically. I don't know, not exactly, but we made race by oppression, man. We made race by slavery and exploitation and colonialism. Slavery was manufactured by those activities, and it fed back in. Race was manufactured by those activities, and it fed back into those activities. These are power structures, not antecedent realities. Same with classes, man. This proletariat thing, who's actually the messiah of the end of history in Marxism or whatever. Okay, this is a cobbled together category. People talk about the proletariat in this really wild, abstract way long after the golden era of industrial capitalism and stuff like that, and long after we could really decide clearly who is and who is not a proletariat. Though I'm going to admit that social classes have somewhat more empirical purchase than races, which are complete horseshit or only artifacts of power. But now social classes and economic inequalities, who's going to deny that those are artifacts of power? Social classes are made by oppressions. And now here we agree with Marx. All right, and much less nations, which have to be enforced by every possible technology, man, by linguistic strictures, by all the way up to exiling and camps and genocides and shit like this. And, and all these things are the sources of wars. So I want to say that basically these collective identities are fictions, but not mere fictions, because they get embodied in physical reality by enforcement. They're fantasies, they're wishes that become realities through enforcement, like Plato's 3 classes of people, which is a fantasy, a fiction, he says that gets transformed into reality by eugenics. So there are not these 3 classes, we made them up, but through oppression, we can make them real. And that is how nations, races, and classes are made. there's no point in taking any of them non-problematically. There's no point in deciding like which is fundamental, the collective or the individual or something like this. I could see, and I will try to grapple with this, the individual human being as also potentially a product of ideology and stuff like this. Okay, and it's often said to be capitalist ideology. Though I actually think that the separation of my body from other human bodies, which is rough, and sometimes we merge and stuff like this, is actually a fact in the way that the separation of the Caucasoid from the Mongoloid races is really, really not a fact, right? But let me just say, like, however we're going to do human ontology, whether it's individuals or collectives, has political consequences, and you should consider whether this is a fictional construction and also what the effects will be, okay, and why someone wants this to be what human beings are and what they will do with that invention. Because you could try to stop doing this and stop telling people who they are and stop manufacturing fundamental identities and stop trying to force people to be Germans or Americans or whatever, Stop creating whole cultures to make it so that there's a next generation of white people or whatever, and all that means. Like, let people go and see what happens. Like, there's a complex merging and diverging of groups, okay? And, some of those identities are pretty fundamental. Some of them are casual. All of them can flow in and flow out. And if you try to fix them and assign them and make them the ultimate ontology of human being, then you're a totalitarian. Okay, and this came from the 19th century, and you're liable to be in genocide and war. So really think about that. But this whole history of Western philosophy gears up for that. Collective identities in an uncritical way that is so obviously problematic. Okay, like we Germans or whatever. Oh my God, fuck you. All right. Now, so like, where are we going to go from here? We've just done Marx, and like I say, sort of geared up for 20th century totalitarianism. Marx has a pretty Platonic fantasy, if you ask me. Really does. In the Communist Manifesto, although it's just reality. It's not something that he wants to make happen. It's just what will happen. But he has a very Platonic mind control and control everybody's body all day, every day, like little marionettes fantasy, okay, of what he's doing. But by the time you get to the mid-19th century and by the time you get to the mid-20th century, you can do more than fantasize. You can really institute some surveillance, man. And these systems, especially ones that came out of Marx, developed technologies of surveillance and stuff like to a beautiful degree. Like, I'm not saying this didn't happen in capitalism, and but it happened in a somewhat different way, with somewhat different effects. So like, I think like the sequence we've seen is Plato just total like, let's have a dream. What would you say if you could say anything? And then Marx is like, here's what's coming. This 10-step plan, and it did. And we can fuck you up now and really have a totalitarian system that's true to the whole Western philosophical tradition, a lot of it, right? Now, this is what I'm thinking of doing. All right, so I want to get right-wing totalitarianisms in here too, and of course they are also connected with the tradition. And I mean, is Plato left or right? Lord knows. All right, who cares? I don't know. Neither. Maybe rightish though. Actually, I guess. Because of the crazed elitism or whatever, But Marx has a crazed elitism too. Well, I'm going to do some. I'll do some work on Nietzsche. Blonde beasts, new kinds of cruelty, like gearing up for some kind of fascism, if you ask me. Okay, like, I'm not saying that Hitler was a straight up follower of Nietzsche, or that Nietzsche wouldn't have despised Hitler, but I'm gonna show you like the unbelievable, disturbing, but stray, non-systematic political thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm not exactly going to attribute totalitarianism to him, but I'm going to, like, the way the right wing totalitarians of the 20th century emerged was almost predicted by him and endorsed by him. Nietzsche is one of my favorite philosophers. The guy kind of got me into philosophy. I was very delighted by him as a teenager, but even then I saw that this crap is grotesque. Okay. Even as I read Walter Kaufmann defending him. But we'll get on to this, I guess. And I want to do Heidegger and talk about Heidegger's Nazism. And now we're not just like pretending. Now we're not doing, in fact, he's not really doing political philosophy except by implication. Heidegger, not usually, or not even hardly. There's not like a whole theory of justice of Heidegger or something. I don't think, but he was literally a Nazi. Okay, and so let's work on that. It's not surprising, man. It's not surprising when almost any Western philosopher turns out to be a totalitarian, right? I don't think so, because they came from Plato and shit. So I'm going to do that now. And in the 20th century, I'm a little flummoxed about what to do. Okay, so I just could do a whole bunch of Marxists, because if you're a Marxist, you're very, very likely to be a totalitarian, right? And so, like, I could try to work on Adorno and stuff like this. I don't think Adorno is straightforwardly that. Or Marcuse would be maybe a better example, sort of Frankfurt School connected stuff. I want to talk about Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, among others, defending or inching toward making nice with Stalin all the time, okay? And I'm probably going to do an episode on Sartre's critique of dialectical reasoning, which is just it should be a cautionary tale of what totalitarian politics can do to your philosophy. Vitiate it, Jean-Paul. So I'm still sort of working out. I'm going to do, these are things that I've written about and probably done videos about. I might do a combined episode on Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek on An American Utopia. But you could do much wider in their kind of work, or this late Marxism, I guess. Marxism combined with psychoanalysis, just to get the totalitarianism completely in your mind as well as in your culture. The American Utopia by Jameson seems like it's the grossest thing you've ever read. It's just a casual, stupid totalitarianism. Stupid, really. I hate to say that because Zizek is good on shelling. All right, so now, what is Jameson good on? Anyway, and I have done a series of videos on Philip Pettit of Princeton's recent book, The State, and I might end up, recapitulating my observations that this is an amazing resurgence of extreme authoritarianism, just blandly put forward as a set of definitions or something like this by someone who used to be a Republican. And I'm stunned by that, but it's also a return. I imagine what it feels like to return to this, to totalitarianism is a relief. Like, back to Plato, man. Like, now, this is who we really are. Because this shit infests the Western tradition. And you should know that if you're thinking about the Western tradition, or if you're exalting or immersing yourself in the Western tradition. Different stuff can emerge from the Western tradition too, and anarchism did, I guess. But are you going to read that in political philosophy? Maybe.